wants to be involved in the greater struggle for black liberation. Malcolm would meet Fidel Castro in 1960. And most people don't know this story, that Castro in 1960 would attend the United Nations hearings in session. This is before they decided to go the road of communism, which really took root in 1965. And the Castro and his entourage came to a downtown hotel in Manhattan, New York. And basically, the folks that run the hotel basically told him to leave. And Malcolm got on the phone and said, invite Castro to Harlem. When we think of Harlem, it's not just the mecca of black America, but in fact, it is the mecca of politics, of music, of art. And in many ways, Malcolm had a midnight late meeting with Fidel Castro in 1960. Malcolm started talking about the Belgian Empire in Central Africa in the Congo. He started talking about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister, in 1961. Malcolm was the first to talk about French imperialism in Indochina and in Vietnam. Later, the United States would enter Vietnam. Malcolm, before even Dr. King uttered a word about Vietnam in his famous speech, the 1967 Why I Must Break My Silence, it was Malcolm X that was talking about Vietnam and US and Belgium imperialism. But what came to a head between the Nation of Islam leadership and Malcolm X was the question of the police shooting of a black Muslim in Los Angeles in 1962. Malcolm was sent out by the leadership, and what Malcolm wanted to do was to form a united front movement in order to bring an indictment, keep that in mind, an indictment on the police officers. But the Nation of Islam decided, the leadership said, stop. We don't want that kind of pressure put upon us. We don't want more state repression put on the Nation of Islam. And in many ways, that was what was the most defining moment of Malcolm's time in the Nation of Islam. He wanted to engage in the struggle. But the leadership, which was a very conservative organization, let's keep in mind, stifled and in many ways corralled the development of Malcolm X. And then in 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, an American Irish Brahmin, would be shot dead in Dallas, Texas, November 1963. And the call from Elijah Muhammad and the leadership to all the ministers, don't talk about John F. Kennedy in your sermons, because he was a beloved man. And Malcolm gave a speech that day. And Malcolm never would give interviews at the end of the speech, but he allowed the press to talk to him that day. And when the person asked him about John F. Kennedy, he said, the chickens come home to roost. The violence to which you send out in the Congo, the violence that you send out in Indochina or Vietnam, has now come back to strike your own. In many ways, that was the pretext to get Malcolm out of the Nation of Islam. And for 90 days, he was put into exile. He was not allowed to speak or preach. In those 90 days, he would go down to Miami, Florida, where a young boxer was preparing for the heavyweight championship of the world. And Malcolm was teaching and being a mentor to this young boxer. And the boxer won the championship, beating Sonny Liston in 7. Yeah. And Malcolm was hoping that if he could bring this young boxer to the Nation of Islam, it would allow Malcolm to re-enter the organization again. The Nation of Islam every year has this thing called Savior's Day. It's a gathering like this, but just bigger. And they invited the young boxer to the event and put Malcolm to the side and disinvited him. And on that day, in Savior's Day, the man known as Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali. And in many ways, Malcolm understood at that juncture that his time in the Nation of Islam was over. And on March 8th, 1964, Malcolm made the decision to make a clean break from the Nation of Islam. He formed 2 organizations, Muslim Mosque Incorporated, for those who were followers of him in the Nation of Islam, And two, he developed in June 1964 the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Malcolm would travel the world, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Malcolm began to propose this idea of taking the United States to the World Court and bringing them up on charges of crimes against humanity of 22 million black people. Malcolm began to make the link between civil rights and human rights in the most oppressed societies on the planet. Malcolm was doing what, as I had pointed out earlier, what Robeson and Dr. Du Bois was trying to do, link civil rights with human rights, the struggle at home and the struggle abroad. In 1951, there was a document produced called We Charge Genocide, produced by Robeson, produced by Du Bois, produced by members of the Communist Party and other left activists. And they was planning on going to the United Nations and charge America with crimes of lynching and police brutality. And Malcolm, in many ways, some 14 years later, would try to do the same thing and take the United States to the United Nations and charge America with genocide. Three profound speeches that I hope you all study and listen to. 1963, the message to the grassroots. 1964, April, the ballot or the bullet. And what I think is his landmark speech that's not talked about too often is his speech at the Oxford Union debate, December 3rd, 1964. Malcolm's achievement, yes, he is not Dr. King. He doesn't have the voting rights or the civil rights bill behind his name and his legacy. But what Malcolm left us is far more even deeper, in fact. He spoke out against empire when it wasn't popular. Keep in mind, we're talking about the anti-communist era, the Cold War. His internationalism, the way my organization in the United States and your organization here talks about. We don't talk about Northern Ireland. We don't talk about Harlem, to where I'm born and raised. We always start out, what's going on in Russia? What's going on in Brazil and Bolivia? What's going on in South Africa? Our point of departure is the international struggle. And then we bring those lessons home for us here in Northern Ireland. His great contribution was the rejection of liberalism. This idea that people just want to get reforms from the system, but not tear down the system of oppression and exploitation. Malcolm rejected the two parties of big business, the Democrats and the Republicans. He advocated, at the height of state-sponsored violence against African Americans, the right of self-defense and the right of organization. But one of his great contributions is that he understood, more so than any other activist at that particular moment in time, that racism was etched in the DNA of American and global capitalism. And that he understood that you cannot extract racism from capitalism and capitalism from racism. You must extract and destroy both at the same time. And so in many ways, Malcolm had influenced a whole generation. The birth of the Black Panther Party in October 1966, various activists and organizations. I'm of the hip-hop generation. And when I listen to P.E., Public Enemy, or KRS-One, I can hear Malcolm. And in many ways, he provided the foundational groundswell of radical ideas for the youth. And why has he survived 50 years? It is what Fred Hampton said, who was the chairman of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. You can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill revolution. And in many ways, the death of Malcolm and Dr. King on April 4, 1968 was a major break on the radical black freedom movement. And now we are here 45, 50 years later. The rise of the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement. Frantz Fanon, who wrote the classic, The Wretched of the Earth, in 1961, would say many years ago, we revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. Yes, overt racism in the United States, the signs of black and white have been torn down. Attitudes and practices on a personal level, have been decreased for some time. You wouldn't have a black president if those attitudes would still be the same. The first black president, Barack Obama. But racism in America is more institutionalized than ever before. Let's look at the material conditions that workers and youth, and particularly black workers, face. There's been a slow, steady, deliberate plan to eradicate all the major gains of the black freedom movement. Let's look at it for 1 second. The economic crisis of 08-09 saw $71 to $92 billion of wealth. Wealth is not what you have in your bank account. Wealth is what you have in property and assets. $71 to $92 billion was the greatest loss of wealth for people of color in modern U.S. history. Under the first black president, Barack Hussein Obama, we had wealth within the black community equal to what we had during slavery. We have seen the rise of a prison nation, where 6 million people held in correctional supervision. I'm talking about prison, parole, probation. Black men and black women make up half of the prison population, which stands at 2.3 million.